So I thank you, Paul, and I begin by acknowledging the honor and privilege to be part of this historic gathering. My thanks to my friend Safi for the invitation to address this group today, and my apologies for having to create the craziness of my joining. My presence was required in our synagogue's religious school on this opening day of our studies. And in fact, I am technically in the middle of teaching our 8th, 9th, and 10th graders, even as I speak to you right now. So if you hear noise in the background, it's them. I want to dedicate my remarks today both to them and to my friend Khalil Shadid, who was responsible for my meeting Dr. Kaskas, and also for bringing me into the world of dialogue between Jews and Muslims, of trialogue between Jews and Muslims and Christians, and to this broader area of interfaith work that is so critical. And I am truly looking forward to catching up on the many presentations before mine that I had to miss while we were running the school this morning. But having been here and having had my students here for your remarks, Dr. Khan, just remarkable. And it is humbling and an honor to follow those. My apologies also if, as I suspect, I am not the first one today to note that the dictionary has two distinct definitions for the word reconciliation. The first, no doubt intended by those who convene this conference, being the action of making one view or belief compatible with another, as in our monthly efforts to reconcile our checkbooks or household budgets, or in the attempt to bring our sacred teachings more in line with one another. But the second definition, I believe, is of equal importance: the restoration of friendly relations, which I believe is the other significant goal of today's sharing. I believe that the first step toward reconciliation must be to acknowledge that we must explain away the occasional text which appears to be less than positively disposed to the traditions of others. But even more, we must acknowledge that each of our faith traditions is multivocal, as Dr. Khan and others I am sure did, that each contains voices more disposed to seeking peace and reconciliation between us, and voices that are less disposed, more interested in asserting our own dominance and uniqueness. And more than that, far too often, for reasons of history and group politics, it seems that the voices of in-group supremacy usually gain ascendancy over those that seek understanding and cooperation between groups. And as a result, the first step in reconciling our various texts in our effort to bring peace and understanding between us needs to be to focus on those whose voices open to strivings, both in our own traditions and in those with whom we seek to reconcile. So like Dr. Khan, I want to take us to a biblical example from the book of Genesis. I want to look at the end of the story of Abraham, in which Hagar becomes such a significant player. But I want to start in chapter 17, when Abraham is recovering from his recent circumcision at age 99, sitting by the opening of his tent at the edge of the desert, when he sees 3 strangers passing by. Despite his age, despite his being in recovery from surgery, despite the heat of the day, he rushes out to greet them and invites them in to join him in a meal, to get out of the heat of the day. So great was his belief in the power of the value of hospitality. He does not recognize these 3 strangers before he runs out and invites them. So it seems clear that their identity and who they actually were cannot be a factor in his desire to offer that hospitality, any more than his current physical state prevented him from acting. And if our reading of that text ended here, we would have a useful text on the value of hospitality to all, one that all of our traditions, I believe, can and do readily accept, at least in the vacuum. But there's so much more to the story here, because it turns out that these strangers are in fact angelic messengers sent to announce the impending birth of Isaac to Sarah in her old age, to bring about the demise of the wicked cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, for sins that included their utter lack of proper hospitality to visitors, as displayed in their reaction to hearing that 2 strangers had come into their community. And that story, in turn, leads to Abraham's negotiation with God to save the lives of the blameless, and of course, to the birth of Isaac, which leads to both the difficult story in Genesis 21, in which Abraham gives in to Sarah's demands that Hagar and Ishmael be sent out, and to the equally challenging story of God's test of Abraham in requiring the sacrifice of Isaac in Genesis chapter 22. Each of these later two stories are powerful in their own right, but are often used to distinguish our differing faiths from each other. My biblical text has God calling for Isaac's sacrifice. I've learned that the Muslim tradition includes a variant form in which God demands the sacrifice not of Isaac, but of Ishmael. And I've learned that for Christians, whichever son they see in the story is an allegorical reference to the sacrifice made by Jesus on the cross. And so here we have an example of what looks like it could become a reconciled text, significant to all three of our faith traditions. And yet the truth is that I have to ask the question, how often do we use this awareness that we all have the version of this text to bring ourselves closer together? It seems that far more often, even those of us in the mainstream or those who specifically work for reconciliation, within each of our religions, it seems that our own version is a correct version to our own believers, usually expressed in a binary manner that at least implies that the others are not correct. And therefore they become one that makes us more likely to argue issues of turf, that the others are an ancient form of cultural appropriation, deliberately distorting our own version. And they become separators and not unifiers. And I think this only gets worse when we realize that the biblical text actually says, in calling Abraham to offer Isaac, that God referred to Isaac as Abraham's favored son. Keep in mind, though, this comes after Ishmael has been sent away. What does it mean to be the only son and the favored son in the house? I'm currently the parent of two children, both in their 20s. One married with a daughter of her own living in another state, the other still living at home. One could see my relationship with my son who still lives with us and presume that he is my favorite child because we are still together so much more often. It's not true, however. I love them both and favor neither of them over the other. And yet when we look at our text, we don't give it that benefit of the doubt. And as a result, these sets of texts often in reality become a point of contention, certainly between Jews and Muslims, and fail to be able to unify. And so it's here that I think the secondary definition of reconciliation becomes critical, that we want to draw closer to each other. The more I have led Torah study groups, the more I have done interfaith work, the more I come to appreciate there is value both in deep diving within my own tradition and in efforts to understand the message through other sets of eyes. I have come to realize that how we view the text matters greatly, sometimes even more than the words of the text itself. So when we Jews read Genesis 22 on Rosh Hashanah, our New Year's Day, one of our most holiest days of the year, of course we are looking for truth on that day, and we are looking for affirmation as Jews. And that setting makes us more likely to care about those internal truths rather than those that can bring about reconciliation with our neighbors. And for most of us, that's when we hear this text repeated every year. And that was true even when at my congregation did for years, we were sitting in a Methodist church hearing those words on Rosh Hashanah. Especially when, as more liberal Reform Jews, this is the only Torah we read on Rosh Hashanah. And the irony here is that it's the more traditional Jews, the less likely to be looking for reconciliation, who read Genesis 21, the story of Hagar and Ishmael, on the first day of the holiday, before we get to Isaac's story in Genesis 22. And few of them, myself included, by the way, see it the way I'm about to share. I have never taught what I'm about to share with you to my congregants. That's why my students are in the room with me, because I want them to hear this today too. Because both stories are vague about the age of Abraham's sons in this their moment on the center stage. In Genesis chapter 21, Ishmael is portrayed at the critical moment as a helpless babe, put under the bush by his mother, Hagar, so that she doesn't hear his cries of hunger and thirst. left to fend for himself and die because she cannot bear this. And in that moment, the Jewish tradition interpreting that chapter tells us her fear and her sense of being helpless to care for her son blind her to the truth that there has to be a water source nearby if there is a bush to hide Ishmael under. And this is seen as not redounding well to Hagar's ability in that moment. I share that because I have to, and then I look to put it aside. Because even more, the characterization of Ishmael's age is belied by the text itself. In this moment, Ishmael can be no younger than 14 and is probably 15 or 16 years old as a result of details shared elsewhere in the Abraham story that I'm not going to go into. Therefore, he is not a helpless babe, needing to be cared for by his mother who can't deal with his crying in that moment. And there's a really good case to be made that he himself was blinded to his own fate and pain and was equally unable to see the presence of the water that allowed the bush to survive and protect him. But even more than that, even more than pointing a finger of blame at him in that moment, it means that he was old enough in the ancient world that Abraham should have been comfortable sending him out into the world as a young man on his own with just his mother with him. He had already come of age, and in a very real sense, the circumcision was his coming of age ritual. And that context is critical in seeing the more conciliatory message of these texts. Because when we compare it to Genesis 22, Isaac's awareness to ask the question of his father, where is the lamb for the sacrifice? And the description of events makes what's happening in that moment sound like Isaac's coming of age ritual, which would put him at roughly age 13 or about the same age as Ishmael in the preceding chapters. And I say this despite knowing that there is a secondary Jewish text that speculates that Isaac may be as old as 37 years old in that moment, which I have always found really problematic and dismissed. So when his father responds with what sounds like a dismissive, God will see to it that there's a lamb, my son, and note the importance of punctuation there and how much that sentence changes with and without the comma that I read it with. God will see to it that there is a lamb, my son. Isaac decides to continue onward up the mountain at Abraham's side freely on his own. And we must see that moment as proving that Isaac is ready for adult responsibilities too. Isaac's faith is challenged every bit as much as Abraham's in those last fraught moments, allowing himself to be bound and put on the altar, trusting if not his father's God, then his father himself, to make sure that the act is not followed through to completion. And when we allow ourselves to read these two texts side by side this way, here and only here do we get an interpretation that makes sense both as a test of Abraham and in a manner that allows us to compare Isaac and Ishmael as equals. In this reading, the test of Abraham, especially after Ishmael has apparently failed to act maturely in his first test as an adult out in the world on his own, is to see if Abraham has properly prepared Isaac for coming of age. Isaac's actions are the proof that Abraham passes this test. And therefore, in both stories, we remove the need to question Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his sons after fighting so hard for the theoretical innocence of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now we can instead see him as a good father, raising his sons to be independent and faithful to God, needing to let them go free with albeit mixed initial results, rather than as a cool and heartless father as we sometimes think of him. But even more, it allows us Jews to see Isaac as being of worthy by his own actions of receiving his father's blessing and birthright, and to see Ishmael as being less worthy by his own actions in his story. And even though I choose to put that interpretation aside as well, it allows us to judge them as equals. It allows me to see those who embrace Ishmael and not Isaac as seeing that Ishmael eventually showed his worthiness. Ironically, by replacing Isaac in my story in being the centerpiece of the Islamic story of the sacrifice. If he said the same things that Isaac said in mine, if he acted the same way as Isaac does in my Bible story, then Ishmael succeeds in his second test where he failed in the first. and therefore I don't have to choose to see mine as better than yours, to see Ishmael as being less than Isaac. It just took him 2 tries in the way I read these texts. And as one who didn't get into rabbinical school the first time I applied, I'm a big favorite of people who do well the second time and get that second chance. Now, having the ability to determine that the decision between stepbrothers was not based on a choice rooted in lineage, but rather on their personal merit, as demonstrated by their own actions, is essential for us to be able to accept the same version of the story without rancor of apparent favoritism. There's even a similar interpretation and comparison available to Jacob and Esau, the twin sons of Isaac, also seen as ancestors to Jews and Muslims respectively, and the story in which it appears Jacob deceives his father and steals their father's blessing from Esau, again the firstborn, but also their father's favored son. In that reading, Jacob knows exactly who needs to get the blessing, because Rebekah, who has been given the prophecy by God that the older shall serve the younger, had shared it with him, and because he sees Jacob's worthiness, where Esau's remains hidden to him, even though he favors Esau. He gives each son a blessing when he's being duped, unsure completely as to which one is standing before him in that moment, but later calls Jacob to him personally to receive the blessing, so that he can be sure that he is in fact blessing the proper deserving son. And of course, in my Jewish Bible, it's the one who is the ancestor of the Jews who is seen as worthy. Of course, in the Muslim version, it's the one who is seen as the ancestor of the Muslims who is seen as worthy. It's what we share in common. Get past the details, find the commonality. So at the end of the day, it seems clear that with careful attention to the text itself, and a clearly defined desire to use our text to reconcile our faiths with each other, there are plenty of possibilities for interpretation and understanding that lead to more conciliatory lessons emerging from the sacred pages. And there again is the rub, as each of our faith traditions have subgroups that will come down on each side of that forced choice between following the letter of the text and the spirit of the text. Those that choose to follow the letter are often more likely to find the text giving them messages of their personal ascendancy and primacy over others, while those that choose to follow the spirit of the text tend to be more open to the possibilities of interfaith cooperation, understanding, and commonality that we have noted today, that lead to the possibility of reconciliation. But in a world in which we are increasingly recognizing that there are far fewer forced binary choices in our lives than it may seem, true reconciliation will likely be found amongst those whose interpretations of their own texts are authentically true to their received traditions, and yet still flexible enough to support both an internally distinct understanding and an externally more universal one as well at the same time. And so ultimately, it is how we choose to reconcile ourselves with our texts, whether we choose to take a more fundamentalist literal approach or a more universalist conciliatory approach, or even one that straddles the fence too often erected to divide us, that is likely the biggest factor in whether we can succeed in reconciling our texts for the sake of greater understanding and deeper peace, of reconciling our peoples and working together to improve our world. I thank you for this opportunity to share, and I look forward to learning.
Oh, subhanAllah, thank you so much, Rabbi. That was absolutely beautiful. And I've always had a similar approach to the story of Isaac and Ishmael myself, but yours is different. But I've always looked at the commonality, between the two stories. And ultimately for me, it doesn't really matter whether it was Isaac or Ishmael. At the heart of the story, what matters is the contents of the story and the actual meaning of it. And the fact that, it was a test of Abraham's faith, and it was a test of their faith, and it tested their responsibilities. I like that nice twist you put on it, because I think this is a very good point. I read something recently about the age of them when this apparently happened, and the fact that they were much older than is often portrayed. It's something that, shockingly, I'd never heard before and I'd never read before. And it was only literally think maybe a month or two ago, I happened upon an article which actually discussed this. And herein is the issue, there's so much information out there that can actually help us to come to some kind of better understanding and reconciliation. And yet all too often that's not shared, but some narrow-minded, foolish, often totally outdated and outmoded idea is pushed. And we need to be aware of that. We all need to be aware of that, whichever our faith. So thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And Baruch Hashem, may the Almighty bless you and your community.